issues. And I feel like where my heart is currently is within special ed and helping, especially those visually impaired, so that then they can, find different tools and different abilities to make their lives better. I just feel like it's more fulfilling that way rather than just doing IT. So,
visual impairment is a low incidence disability, right?
Have you heard about the middle school football player that's visually impaired? It came out. It came out this last weekend. His dad is part of the coaching staff, and most schools denied him. But he has a microphone or headphones inside his helmet, and that's how he knows where to go on the field.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty cool.
That's amazing.
I can't remember what school it is, but the article came out just past week. So, pretty awesome.
Pretty impressive, yeah, for sure.
No other new faces, so I won't make you introduce yourselves again. All right, so we'll just have a quick look at the syllabus and
keep it on one screen.
I'm going to put it on the screen. Oh yeah, there's my daughter. You can see her.
No.
Oh, I guess you can't see my background. That's right. Okay. So theories and characteristics of exceptionality. Why do we use the term exceptionality?
Because they're exceptional individuals.
Right. Why not just disability?
Because it's not necessarily a disability thing. What about gifted and talented, for example? They're also exceptional in their own way.
Right. We have to consider each individual, kind of in accordance with their own profile of strengths and uniquenesses. But also, our textbook uses the term exceptionality because it also includes a chapter on gifted and talented students. So were we to just be focused on disabilities, we would exclude that group. So it sounds like most people have the textbook. Is anyone still waiting on it? No? Good. Yeah, so we're gonna, we'll talk about the history of special education. We'll talk about different theories related to disability, focusing on the kind of individual profiles that are characteristic of each of the 13 disability categories recognized by the IDEA. And then there are a whole bunch more instructional goals and objectives. I'm going to leave this reading to you all. I'm not going to read through every one of these. So you'll see that we will be reading each week. We've got our assigned readings here. Week 11 will be an asynchronous meeting. So that just means that we won't be using Zoom to come together as a group. And that's when you will be completing your take-home final. And so the take-home final is not going to be too heavy, just about 300 short essay questions. So, I mean, you knock it out in a day. No one laughed at my joke. Oh, Becca did. So it'll be a combination of short answer and multiple choice questions.
Can you go over the presentation of term papers again? How are we doing that?
Oh, we're going to do it just like we're talking right now.
Okay, perfect. I heard half of it. I missed what you said. So.
Oh, I actually hadn't even got to that yet.
Oh, but never mind. Jump the gun again.
I'm going to talk about the paper first.
Okay.
Talk about the paper to give the presentation.
Sorry.
So the main assignment for this course is going to be a 3-page double-spaced paper that's going to focus on a disability category, or a topic regarding disability that you find interesting and would like to research further. I intentionally left kind of the guidelines very open because I want to give you all the opportunity to, explore your interests. Again, it can be any disability, and you can take a very kind of narrow focus. Maybe you want to talk about, social cognitive challenges characteristic of people with level 3 autism. Or maybe you just want to talk about learning disabilities as a group. So you can, the extent to which you zoom in or stay zoomed out is up to you. So again, 3 pages in length, and you must include a minimum of 3 peer-reviewed articles as references. You can use your textbook if you would like. I will allow that for one of them. You can use more references if you would like, but there needs to be a minimum of 3. Now, this will need to be APA formatted, and I'm wondering, is anyone unfamiliar with the APA requirements? Okay.
I did MLA all through grad school.
Oh, MLA. No, that's not what we use in education.
Or science.
Or science, exactly.
I got from undergrad, APA. So.
APA has got to be the most annoying thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're writing like a 250-page dissertation. You got to keep track of where commas are and, what should be capitalized and whatnot. So again, 3 references minimum. And I'm gonna show you all a very useful online resource that's going to answer all of your APA questions.
Al Purdue.
That's it. Also, as EOU students, you have access to the Pierce online library and the electronic databases that we subscribe to. And we're gonna have a look at that interface too. On the last day of class, you will be asked to give a 10-minute presentation about your paper, okay? And again, I'm gonna leave it up to you to decide. Perhaps you just wanna kind of free-form talk about your paper topic. Maybe you wanna make a set of slides. Maybe you just wanna read your paper. Again, the important part is you're just sharing with the group what you learned over the course of researching and writing the paper. And that's going to be due on December 3rd. If you can't get it done by then, talk to me. But 3 pages should be pretty easy to knock out.
Can it be longer?
It can. Let's say you start writing and you're just on a roll. You try to keep it below 10 pages. So, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the Purdue OWL webpage. That is your one-stop shop for APA. Once we get to that page, you're going to see that there are a very large number of kind of features that are required to be in accordance with APA's requirements. I am only going to ask you to use 3 of them, okay? And that is to use the proper formatting for in-text citations, to use the proper formatting for making a reference list, and to use the page formatting requirements required by APA. And that is double-spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margins. It's all pretty straightforward stuff. And then I already mentioned the final. Before we leave the syllabus and go exploring the APA webpage and the library, are there any questions? Okay, let's do this.
Sorry, I was unmuting myself. I just want to double check the proper formatting for in-text referencing, the reference list, and page formatting.
Right. And what I'll do is I'll send you all an email with that information, because I should have put that here. I just told you what not to use. I should have just told you what to use, right? In my mind, I knew what you should use, and I just assumed that you all would read my mind, but that doesn't always work. Okay, so Purdue Online Writing Lab. Has everyone seen this?
Yes.
And we're going to go here to APA style. Okay. So we are going to, they've updated their, so here you have research and citation references. That knocks out 2 of your 3 requirements right there. Oh, what happened? Okay, here we go. So in-text citations. You use an in-text citation when you are communicating an idea that is not your original idea. Okay? So for example, let's say that you're writing about autism, and you are talking about a research study that found differences in theory of mind ability between students with autism and students without disabilities. Well, chances are you didn't conduct that research study, so you would have to let the reader know that you're taking this information from this particular author. It's basically how you give people props in the context of academic writing. Okay. Oh, they should give us some examples here. Oh, here we go. So it's a pretty basic format in text. It's just the name of the author or the authors, and then the date of publication, enclosed in parentheses. And you have kind of 2 different ways of going about it. You can see in this example that the writer is explicitly referring to the authors and then communicating their idea. Whereas this example, we don't see what the author wrote before they use the citation, but this is an example of where they would just kind of be summarizing or paraphrasing, whatever it is that they were, taking from the paper that these people authored. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there are, kind of different situations to be aware of, number of authors, unknown authors, an organization as an author. So there are a whole bunch of variations, that APA wants you to be aware of. We don't need to go through all of them. And what I'll do is I will, in the email that I send out to you all that lists the APA requirements, I'll include this link as well in the email. Okay. So we've talked about in-text citations. Now we're going to just go look at a reference list. So you'll see here that APA has different, basically different criteria for different types of references. So I'm asking you to use a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. And so we're going to look at good. So here's an example of a paper or a reference that was taken from a peer-reviewed journal. So the first thing to notice is that references are formatted using hanging indent. Is everyone familiar with how to use a hanging indent?
Yes.
Okay. If not, Google is your friend. So again, we'll see that here we have the author's last name and first 2 initials. the date of publication, the title of the paper. And here's one thing to pay attention to. You notice that in the title of the paper, only the first letter in the first word is capitalized. All other words are lowercase. And then in italics, we have the name of the journal. And then we have the volume or edition. And then we have the pages within the journal that this article appeared in.
Doesn't it have to be alphabetical order too?
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't know if it says it in there, but.
Yeah, I think if we looked at reference list basic rules, it would tell us that. Here's another detail the APA would like to get you on. I mentioned that only the first letter in the first word of the journal title is capitalized. Well, that rule applies unless there's a colon in the title. If there's a colon in the title, then the word that appears directly after the colon is capitalized. So that is a journal. We'll look at a book real quick, because again, a book is going to have a slightly different variation. So here we see the most basic version of an APA reference for a book. Again, exactly the same as the journal. Authors, followed by date of publication. We have the title of the book in italics. Again, with only the first letter of the first word capitalized, except for in this case, we have the acronym APA, so it all needs to be capitalized. And then we have the state and city where the book is published, and lastly, the publisher. And one more variation. Sometimes you have a book that is an edited volume. So an edited volume just includes chapters by a number of different authors. Again, it's exactly the same, except here we're indicating that these individuals are the authors. And that's going to be it. Again, I mentioned there is a lot of, APA has a lot of rules, but I'm only asking you to use 3 of them. Any questions on APA? Excellent.
Thanks for not making us do an abstract.
Right. No need for the abstract. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the Pierce Library. Has anyone not had the opportunity to go to this webpage yet? Okay. So library.eou.edu. What you're going to want to do is come here and select databases. Okay. So we have access to a whole bunch of databases by virtue of the fact that we're EOU students and we pay tuition. So I'm going to just share with you a couple of the more kind of common, useful databases. The first one is Academic Search Complete. And so Academic Search Complete covers a lot of content. So as you can see here, STEM research, articles in the very broad field of the social sciences and humanities, and some examples: anthropology, engineering, law, sciences, education would be there as well. So that's a good one. The only downfall to it, I would say, is that, since it is so broad, when you try to search for an article, being that we're in special education, we want kind of articles in the field of special education. Well, you might get a lot of additional articles that aren't going to be relevant. education full text is a very good one for this project. And I'm just going to show you real quickly. So you've got a number of different windows in which to enter terms that you want to use for searching. So let's say, staying true to my form, I'm going to search for autism. Okay, autism. Let's see what I get. What do you think? I'm thinking I'm going to get about 13,000 articles. Not a very good search. So that doesn't help me.
Change your date range.
Right. So maybe I just want to know about. So I'm going to keep this optional, and I'm going to search social or theory of mind. And now let's say that I know the author. I'm looking for a very specific author, Simon Baron-Cohen, who is kind of the person who is famous for researching theory of mind in people with autism. Interestingly, Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a renowned English autism researcher, is cousins with Sacha Baron Cohen, Borat. They occupy two opposite ends of the spectrum. So if you click this little drop-down menu, you can see that you can, you can look for other kind of specific features. So let's say you want, a title, the title of the paper. You can just type the title in. The journal. You want to look at a specific journal. Or you want to find the author, and where is that? Author personal. So I'm going to look Baron. There it is. So you'll see here that I got a number of papers on which Simon Baron-Cohen is an author. You can add more of these as well. I want to show you one more thing. So in addition to being able to kind of really hone your search in using these search windows, you can also come down here and you have a whole bunch of filters. So you can limit the range of dates within which you want to conduct your search. You can change the publication type. So if I'm asking you to get peer-reviewed journals, you should probably choose academic journal. Oh no, sorry, right here. Scholarly, peer-reviewed journals. That's what you're going to want to click. So if you click that button, then you are only going to get peer-reviewed journals. That's a very quick rundown of the online databases that we have access to as students. Any questions? Okay. And for most articles, you have a download, PDF download. Sometimes you won't. And so, like for example, this one here, we don't see the PDF logo. So we're going to see if EOU has access to the journal. So we do. So we can access a request, come down here, and we see that the full text is available right here at this link. And there it is. Now I download my PDF. Simple as that. If you're having any difficulties locating resources for the paper, just go ahead and let me know, okay? Okay, so let us jump indoor material. Any questions or anything before I move on? Great. As usual, I've explained myself with 100% clarity. Okay, so did everyone get to do the readings?
The article?
Yes.
Yes.
So we had one pretty long one, the Carrier piece, the sociology of special education. And then we had the piece by Haslam, Kinds of Kinds. So what was a theme? Did anyone pick up on a theme that was kind of shared between the two papers?
Oh, they're really dry.
Dry? That was exciting. That was page-turning material.
I think it was kind of talking about like the categories that we put students into and like what defines those categories. And I think it's not really as clear as a lot of people outside of special education think it is.
Right. So what was Carrier's position?
Carrier, so I highlighted a few things.
And you got to learn a bit about the history of the educational system in England, just at no extra charge.
Yeah. I highlighted a few things in the Carrier article because there are teachers at my school who treat special education students like not the way I would like them to treat them. So, like, I don't know.
Carrier is a sociologist, right? The sociology of special education. So as a sociologist writing about the sociology of special education, where is he going to, what argument is he going to make? That it is blank that is kind of responsible for kind of constructing disability.
The community.
Social factors, right? He has a nice quote here. Let me just go ahead and pull it up. Educational handicaps in the fields of educational psychology, which studies them, and special education, which treats them, are social products that are affected by social forces, reflecting social interests and amenable to sociological analysis. All social. What are some reactions to that claim? Nate?
I'm in my personal experience dealing with kids, and I work in a behavior classroom.
Yeah.
Every single thing that I see is tied to the social constructs that these children live within.
Right.
There's
the structure of school, right?
Yeah. The structure of school, the structure or lack of structure in their home lives.
Right.
It can all be distilled down into put into that category of a social construct.
Right. And so, he definitely goes on at length to make his point. But this is a very seminal piece of writing in special education research. And so, I felt that you all would appreciate it, even though it was a bit long. And so Carrier is really focused on the social. Now, how about Haslam? What is he? Is he focused on just kind of one explanation?
No.
Nate, what is his position?
His position is that everything exists on a spectrum, and that there are certain kind of points within that spectrum that warrant diagnoses. Like he gives the example of blood pressure. And he says that at a certain blood pressure, there becomes a risk and a benefit to treatment, and that's usually when the diagnosis is made.
Right.
But it all kind of exists along this path that for everyone.
Right, and he qualifies that example, the blood pressure example, by saying that, the cut point, right? He talks about cut points, is essentially arbitrary. It's meaningful, right? Because if that cut point was up too high, well, then you're putting a lot of people at risk of, suffering from the downsides of high blood pressure. Whereas if it's too low, well, then you're going to, have too many false positives.
Yeah.
So while it is arbitrary, it's meaningful. It has practical implications. Excellent. So we are going to, what I'd like to do today is just kind of walk you through kind of how, at a very broad level, based on kind of the social context, how we thought about disability, how we categorize disability, and the reasons that we made these distinctions have changed, okay? And then I have a case study, and we're going to look at some information regarding autism. As you all know, there are some in this world who purport that we are in the midst of an autism epidemic, right? That just all of a sudden, there's just all kinds of autism. So we're going to look at kind of some alternative explanations that might explain, these dramatic increases in prevalence that don't have to do with just an epidemic. That just all of a sudden now there are all these new people with autism. And by the way, if you're interested, there's a great book called Neurotribes. And
you say neurotribes?
Neurotribes, yeah. The author's name is escaping me. But it's all about kind of addressing this idea of the autism epidemic and how, well, in actuality, it's not an epidemic. He provides many historical case studies of like very prominent scientists and figures, going all the way back to like the 13th century. There are anecdotes about them, and the behaviors and the things that these authors are describing about these individuals are very characteristic of somebody with autism. And so, it's speaking to the social kind of factor again. And so we might get out of here a bit early today. I don't know. Just depends on how talkative you all are. Oh, and before I get going, I want to show you another book. And so the stuff that I'm going to talk about first came from this book. It's called The Autism Matrix. Okay? And so Gail Eyal is also a sociologist. So if you thought that carrier piece was heavy reading, wait till you sink your teeth into this stuff right here. And so again, he's making an argument, that it's really kind of the shift in how we treated people or educated people with disabilities that allowed for autism to kind of blow up. Whereas, when we look at how we treated people with disabilities from a historical context, what did we do in the 1920s, 1910s? People with severe disabilities, did they tend to go to school?
No, it could have been like an institution.
Institutionalization, exactly. And so the era of institutionalization is characterized by very specific kind of, ideologies and understandings of disability and, social factors that really informed how people thought about disability during that time frame. Okay.
There was one I found the highlighted part that I really liked in the Carrier article.
Mm-hmm.
And it said it was a study that was done, and it said that basically shows that teachers use the labels that they attach to pupils to justify their educational achievement. So pupils who they responded to being labeled as deviant, and then they became more deviant. And so I experienced that in my classroom because I also teach a behavior classroom. And so I have teachers who will say, oh, they should be in your room, and they'll put them in my room as like a calm space, but then they will think, oh, well, I'm a bad kid, I'm an SPC kid now. And then they'll like learn more behaviors, and their behaviors will escalate instead of the opposite, because they think now that they're bad. Right. And I'm like, no, you're not, you're great, everybody's great, nobody's in here because they're bad.
Right. So it becomes just a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh yes, it's happened a few times.
I had that highlighted too.
Yes, it's funny.
Right, so IDEA serves or recognizes 13 disability categories. However, when we go back in time, to the beginning of the 20th century, we didn't have that framework for diagnosis or categorization in place. We had a completely different system, completely different labels. And I want to open the floor to you all. There are basically three main categories in which people were diagnosed under. I would like you all to, they're what are considered kind of derogatory terms now, but these were actual, scientifically accepted diagnostic categories. So who thinks they know what one is?
I do.
Crystal?
Mentally retarded.
That's one. Good.
Hate it. I call it the R word.
Good.
Okay.
I think another one would be handicapped.
You've jumped ahead into the future too far.
Emotionally disturbed.
What's that?
Emotionally disturbed.
So yeah, that's also kind of a bit ahead of where I'm at now. These are words. So here's a hint. That guy is such an
idiot.
Idiot. Yeah, that was a diagnosis. Idiocy. Anyone else want to take a crack?
Does it have to do with like an emotional disability, or?
No, I mean what we would call so emotional disability or emotional disorder was kind of one of the categories introduced kind of after this scheme was in place. So it was included with these. So we had idiots, and these are classified in order from most to least severe. So an idiot was the least impacted. An imbecile was more impacted than an idiot. And then you had morons, which were the worse off. And morons were variably referred to as feeble-minded. Another term for morons is feeble-mindedness, mentally retarded, subnormal. So this was the framework. And we talked about the use of these types of tests and how they can be kind of culturally biased and incorrectly, classify people as having conditions. What type of tests were those? Talked about them yesterday.
The IQ?
The IQ test, right. So IQ tests were, they figured very heavily into, the decisions for making these classifications. And again, these varieties of mental deficiency, as you can see here, they weren't like, precise psychological, diagnoses. They weren't, they weren't made after, interviewing the person's mom and dad, interviewing the person's teacher, doing a 4-hour observation, right? Like we would diagnose autism, for example. Often, these were classifications were made after giving somebody an IQ test. And if they scored below a certain threshold, and especially if they were minorities, they were from low socioeconomic backgrounds, they, they ran the risk of being institutionalized, right? So we're talking about like the 1930s and 1940s. Social incapacity was considered like a very bad thing. Posing a threat to the well-being individuals of the society at large. And so they were put into institutions. And depending on the diagnosis that you were given, you might be able to get out eventually. You might be able to get out, but only after being sterilized, right? So this is we're talking about the era of like eugenics and like forced sterilization. And those were definitely, practices in the early 20th century. That were believed would kind of curb this kind of widespread, plague of social incapacity.
Come a long way.
Yes. So deinstitutionalization was a very kind of slow process. It started like in the 40s and 50s. But we do have already in the 20s, kind of a shift away from the institution for the primary location of, treating people with disabilities, if you could call it treatment. Institutions were notoriously terrible places. And oftentimes, once you got into an institution, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. You kind of like went crazy, as it were, just because the sanitary conditions and whatnot were so poor.
Didn't they medicate some individuals?
Yeah, they would give lobotomies. Absolutely. So the mental hygienist movement. This is kind of the earliest example of a community-based kind of approach for dealing with mental problems. That kind of was a precursor to special education. And so, importantly, it was a multidisciplinary movement. So you had people from a variety of professions who were kind of promoting this idea of mental hygiene, right? So again, the institution was intended to treat mental illness, right? Once it was already manifest. Mental hygienists, they emphasized the early intervention. They wanted to prevent mental illness and mental health issues, okay? They wanted to promote kind of healthy individuals. So they wanted to kind of get the kids very early on, as soon as parents, kind of realized that something was wrong with their child or might be wrong. And, even up to the 40s, kind of middle class. So I mentioned that often institutions were kind of most heavily populated by people from low socioeconomic backgrounds and minorities. There was a huge push by doctors they would encourage families to put their children into institutions because, their justification was that, well, if you try to raise this kid on your own, it's going to be very difficult. And then, that difficulty is going to lead to stress, and that stress is going to impact, your relationship with your other children, and that's going to impact how you, interact with other people in the community. And so that's kind of, that is going to be promoting a very kind of negative, kind of experience. And so they would say it's ideal just to give your kid up, which is terrible. The mental hygienists also recognize the potential importance of the educational system, right? School, as a vehicle for kind of teaching and enacting, their preventative activities. So another, important contribution by this movement was that this was kind of during the area when research on child development was, starting. So you had people like Jean Piaget. We've all heard of Piaget's stages of development, cognitive development. So these individuals, they understood the importance of this research, and they understood the importance of developing a curriculum that is kind of in step, that progresses in step with how kids develop. Of course, this, we take that for granted nowadays. We know that's how it should be, right? There's a certain progression for how we teach math or how we teach reading, which is informed by research into how those capacities develop in children. And then in the 50s, we're getting close to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, a new wave of child guidance. So these were called, so the mental hygienists kind of had this philosophy of, preventative care. And what they did is they opened things called child guidance clinics. These were, community-based centers for, basically supporting kids with mental health issues. And so we can see that they're understanding the importance of evaluation, diagnosis, the development of treatment plans to meet the needs of the people that they served. So this is kind of corresponding with the early stages of deinstitutionalization. When people really started to realize the horrors that were going on in many of these places, and the government started shutting them down. And you see here, look at the staff lineup there. That's, what we see in, very well-funded and organized schools. So while this wasn't, in the context of the public school, certainly all the components that we now see are mandated by, IDEA were in place in these child guidance clinics. Let me check the time real quick. Okay, and so the three categories of diagnosis that I mentioned earlier, imbecile, idiot, and moron, these were the classifications that people were given when they were put into institutions. And so these distinctions were actually meaningful in the context of an institution. However, once we made a shift to community-based treatment for people with disabilities, well, these schemes for categorization proved problematic.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So idiot, would that be based off of mental or physical? Do you know how they categorized? Or how they...
It was mostly mental.
Okay.
Mental deficiency,
So physical they didn't really look at back then?
Well, no, they did. I think people with, very serious physical disabilities often wound up in institutions. Absolutely. Okay. There are these things called ugly laws, and there are ugly laws in San Francisco, Cincinnati, Ohio, Denver, Colorado, and these were laws put into place that made it illegal for people with disabilities to be in public because they caused too much of a disturbance to the general populace, right? So there certainly were, kind of punishments in place. Right, so in the context of the institution, a categorization of an idiot versus an imbecile versus a moron, well, that might, dictate where you're living in the institution, what ward are you on, it carried information with respect to kind of how capable you were at being able to work, whether or not you would eventually be able to be released, and whether or not you would be sterilized before release. So they served a function. They conveyed information within that kind of social environment. But as I already mentioned, once we shift to a community-based approach, well, these kind of labels were too coarse. they didn't translate well into, they didn't kind of communicate the types of learning differences or challenges that, teachers and whatnot we're starting to see kind of fill schools. And so this is just an example of, how a social factor or a social perspective, can either, make a certain scheme for categorization meaningful or completely irrelevant. I'm going to stop here. Let's take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll get through the rest of the slides. Any questions before we take a break? Awesome. Then I will see you all at 6:05.
Yeah.
Hello again.
Hello.
Mary and Nate, are you there?
I'm here. Yep, I'm just eating. So
Oh. Did you bring enough for everyone?
sure.
Okay, so clearly this was a very abbreviated consideration of kind of this shift from an institutional-based treatment approach to a community-based treatment approach. But I think it's important to understand kind of how prevailing thought and kind of social convention and what is considered normal at different points in history can influence how we think about human condition, in this case disability. And both Carrier and Haslam, they're aware of this. And so I've already read that quote by Carrier. Again, him being a sociologist, certainly the problem is society, capitalism. You can't be a good sociologist unless you find, capitalism to blame for most things. And Haslam also alludes to this. Psychiatric classifications serve professional ends, project societal preoccupations, rest on cultural assumptions, vary across time and space, and interact reciprocally with public perceptions. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to do a little case study on autism. And while he wasn't talking about autism when he wrote all this stuff, basically autism, you can make a case for how this dramatic increase in autism diagnoses, is a projection of societal preoccupations, cultural assumptions, how it's varied across time and space. So it's an interesting case in point. And certainly, I mean, we talked about kind of the fact that, since we have a very particular way that we expect students to learn information in the classroom, sometimes, well, as special education teachers, we're not inflexible, but certainly, maybe some general education teachers can be inflexible. It's kind of that approach is, to some extent, what might kind of cause these disabilities. I mean, I think about like ADHD, really, you know, it can be challenging for kids with ADHD to just sit in their desk chair, right? That's just the convention that we use to educate our students. It's not the only way. You know, there are other ways to learn. So, you know, one could imagine or, you know, understand that, you know, let's go back in time, like, you know, I don't know, 100,000 years. I'm sure there were people with ADHD, but they weren't forced to learn arithmetic, you know, for 2 hours straight in a, you know, classroom with fluorescent lights flashing, right? Outside of that context, maybe somebody, you know, with ADHD could be a very vital asset to the, you know, the tribal community. People with autism, you know, one characteristic of autism is a very kind of narrow range of interests and a very perceptive focus on whatever that area of interest is. So, you know, I envision a time 200,000 years ago when the person with autism could just make some very awesome spear points, right? Perfect, right? This tribe was killing mammoths left and right. And this person was a very valued member of that society. Not suggesting that people with autism are not, in this day and age, valued members of society, but, you know, just to kind of give some counterpoints into kind of how, you know, society can kind of create the disability, as it were. Okay.
So can I ask a quick question?
Colby.
So I understand what you're saying with the autism and with ADD. That makes sense. But like just in my 20 plus years of teaching in the regular ed classroom, there's been a huge, like even in our small community, which has had, Eastern Oregon has had a huge influx with changing of, so we put that parameter on things again and say, okay, our society has kind of been changing with who's been moving into our counties.
Right.
So that could up the levels we're seeing if how you change your parameter there. Yeah. But it is noticeably, and I know friends even in Portland or Eugene, they have noticed this rise also. So I know it's not just a rural thing, but
it's happened over here too.
So it's just interesting that even if you change how you're labeling or what you're grouping or the classification of people, that just maybe across our nation we are seeing a rise of. And is it because we're labeling children more, or because our environmental impacts are changing? Or
I think it's definitely not just one factor. It's a combination of factors.
Population growth.
Yeah, the more people you have, the greater the likelihood that you're going to have more people with, you know, one disability versus another. You know, certainly, I think the label, you know, getting a diagnosis can be important for a parent. You know, when I did my work as an early interventionist, you know, I talked to parents who, when their kid entered their school district, they would shop around for an autism diagnosis. They might go see a child psychiatrist, and that individual would not diagnose their child. So they would go to another one until they got it. Because, you know, in terms of your IEP, having a diagnosis of autism will kind of get you the most services really out of any disability. So, so certainly the label has an impact, right? Because without those supports in the classroom, you know, a child who, you know, maybe is on the borderline, right? Maybe they're, you know, they kind of show characteristics of, you know, ADHD or autism, but they're not fully diagnosed. Like, well, for you to get that instructional supports would greatly improve their educational outcomes.
You know what's interesting about you just saying that is I worked with a kid who got diagnosed. He got diagnosed emotional disturbance, and he barely made autism, but they put that on the IEP. Like he was on that borderline.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
No, it's interesting. I mean, you see, one thing with autism is that it's often comorbid with intellectual disability. So a student will have autism and intellectual disability. And it's like, how do you separate the two? You know, I mean, is it something different, or is it autism and intellectual disability, or is the two together something different? I mean, it's a very interesting body of research, kind of looking at issues with comorbidity, and we're going to look at a graph here that provides some evidence that actually interestingly, as autism diagnoses or number of students served by IDEA with autism increase, we see very marked downward trends in other disability representations, which is suggesting that people, they want the autism diagnosis. And that term is referred to as diagnostic substitution.
So they get the help.
Basically, before autism was introduced in 1991, chances are if you were kind of on the low function end of the spectrum, you were going to get diagnosed with intellectual disability. But once autism came onto the scene and this kind of social awareness grew about it, well, it's having a diagnosis of intellectual disability versus autism is very different. What condition sounds more serious? What label sounds more severe? Intellectual disability. So so it's interesting. But yeah, here's what we see. Since like 2004, we just see these dramatic increases in the number of kids being diagnosed. 1 in 59. What is going on?
I also think that parents are more willing to get their student tested. So like, I think, I could be wrong, but I'm wondering if it has something to do with parents.
Well, you're referring to awareness, right?
I'm sorry?
The parent kind of knows that, is aware of this condition called autism, and so maybe they see like some traits in their child, and so they get them tested.
Right. I know that, and there still is, so there has been a stigma around special education, and I know it still exists, but I think parents are more willing now to try and have their student have their child evaluated. And if the more we're testing them, then it's like, oh, hey, look, they have these traits, these, I don't know if you call them symptoms. I don't know how it's worded, but they have these traits. They tested, for this, and now you have these students that are qualifying for special education under autism.
Right. I mean, when we, go back in time 40 years ago, there was no such thing as Asperger's. I mean, Hans Asperger had written his paper in Germany, but, it hadn't really been brought to the awareness of the United States. But yeah, somebody who might have been diagnosed with Asperger's 10 years ago, well, that person was just a little off, right? They didn't have a label. They were just a little, oh, that's just Jared. He's just a little strange. He's going to chew your ear off about car washes or something, right? So, dramatic increases in prevalence. And so this is the number of children per 1,000 served in special education in an 11-year time period. So we go from just under 2 per 1,000 up to just under 8 per 1,000. And look at this. 1991 is when autism was introduced as a recognized category, a disability category in IDEA. And look what happens after 1991. Autism just takes off. These other conditions, intellectual disability, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, really no change whatsoever. But autism is doing something.
It is interesting. And the thing too with like CP, I know we're talking about autism, but CP and then I'm going to say ID for they're pretty similar because they do tend to, I don't know, coexist together. I can't think of the word.
Here's an important factor to consider. Does anyone know how epilepsy or cerebral palsy are diagnosed? Epilepsy is the presence of seizures, right? Like this person has grand mal seizures. We can see this person seizuring. They can test for it in the brain. Cerebral palsy. Now, I don't know for sure, but is there like can they test for that genetically? Does anyone know?
Oh, well, I know a lot of it has to do, it can be from birth or
complications after birth.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like CP, I think it affects like the lack of oxygen has a big impact on it.
Okay. But here's the thing with autism. Autism is diagnosed on the basis of behavior, okay? So the diagnostic criteria set forth in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5 is the most recent one, it's all behavioral, right? When we don't have a situation that Haslam would refer to as a natural kind, right? There's a very clear biologic underpinning that, you know, when we see it present, like this condition will result 100% of the time. Autism doesn't have that. We'll look at some research, you know, there's a lot of money that goes into funding research to try to find the, you know, the genetic causes of autism, which in my opinion is misplaced research funding. Because autism affects such a broad scope of abilities and, you know, adaptive skills that it's foolish to expect that we're going to find like this smoking gun, that this one gene is going to cause this whole kind of range of impairments in people with autism. In my opinion, that money is better directed to supporting people who are already on this earth with autism. What is it? People have really put a lot of effort into trying to explain what's happening. Why is there so much autism? Which actually is, you know, I showed you a graph about autism, that Autism Speaks graph. Autism Speaks has the puzzle piece as their logo, right? Like, we need to find the missing piece that's going to solve, you know, the autism puzzle. Self-advocates with autism are very, very against that. This whole idea that autism is something that needs to be eliminated from the world, right? Because for these individuals, like, that's their identity. That's how they relate. Like, autism is a very fundamental component of their selves and their beings. So just a little aside. Here it is. Is this the cause of autism?
No.
Look at the relationship between autism and organic food sales. It's like, you find this stuff, you know? There are studies, you know, that suggest that, you know, watching TV causes autism. You know, exposure to like a lot of traffic causes autism. It's some very kind of bizarre explanations. This is actually a joke. This is not like a, this was just kind of a spoof graph. But the remaining 5 or 6 explanations we'll look at are actually real. So it's not organic food sales. So I refer to diagnostic substitution. And so this, these are prevalence per 1,000 using IDEA data from 2001 to 2012. And I mean, look at that. Seems very clear that something is going on. Why would autism be increasing so much and now we're just seeing so much less intellectual disability?
Maybe they were misdiagnosed as intellectually disabled.
Well, there wasn't really a diagnosis of autism until, like, you know, 1994 is when it really blew up, and we're going to look at it.
And if you think of autism and, you know, being nonverbal, you know, especially at a younger age, they could have just assumed that was ID.
Yeah, and I already mentioned the fact that for people who are kind of very severely impacted by autism, oftentimes they have a comorbid intellectual disability diagnosis. So there's like a lot of blending of the lines between like those two populations.
Interesting.
And so this is a very telling graph. Expansion of diagnostic criteria. So you see back here, like in the late 60s, Leo Kanner, he was like the first person to publish in the United States about autism. He published accounts of like 7 case studies. Back then, it was thought to be a very rare condition. Like 1 in like 5,000 people had autism. The DSM. So the DSM-3 is when autism was first introduced. Like when it was its kind of own separate diagnosis. They used to diagnose it as childhood schizophrenia. in about 2000, the DSM-4 was introduced. And look at that spike. Basically, they completely changed the wording of the diagnosis of the language. And we're going to look at an example. So just in 2013, they released the DSM-5. And what they've done is they've made the criteria for an autism diagnosis much more restricted. So now it's harder to get a diagnosis of autism. So like, for example, the DSM-4 is where autism was first introduced as a spectrum disorder. So you had, classic autism, you had Asperger's syndrome, you had pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, social communication disorder. These were all kind of under the same rubric. The DSM-5 eliminated all of them, and now it's just autism spectrum disorder, level 1, 2, or 3. And so here, the top one is the DSM-4, and the bottom one is the DSM-5. And so I would like you first to focus on just the first bullet point in each of those criteria. If you notice anything different in the language, is one more specific than the other? That's what I'll ask.
Yes.
Which one?
5.
Right. How is it more specific?
It's talking more about the deficits in like social skills, basically.
Right.
And verbal and non-verbal.
There's a term there that's not present in the DSM-4 one. Right? Reciprocal.
Reciprocal.
Right? So this kind of narrows it down a little bit. Like your challenges are kind of in the back and forth, the tete-a-tete. Actually, the DSM-4 language is a qualitative impairment in social interaction. How broad is that? What is a qualitative impairment in social interaction? That is so non-specific. A qualitative impairment in communication. So as I mentioned, and then the repetitive and restricted patterns of behavior, that's always been consistent.
Yeah.
Another criteria that they introduced in the DSM-5 is that you have to get the diagnosis by the age of 3, or you need to have like evidence of, kind of their official documentation suggesting that maybe you might have autism if you want to get a diagnosis later in life. The DSM-4, they completely eliminated that age of onset. You could get an autism diagnosis at any point in your life. And so this corresponded with a time that like basically Wired magazine published an Asperger's, I think it was called the autism quotient, or the name is escaping me. But anyway, like it was a very kind of effective, measure. Like if you scored above a certain, amount, well, that didn't mean that you had Asperger's or autism, but it was cause to possibly pursue it, a bit further. And many adults, people were getting diagnosed with autism in their 50s and 60s. And, it was kind of a revolutionary experience. I mean, they had an explanation for why throughout their entire adult lives they had so much difficulty, like maintaining relationships and making friends and stuff, and, getting fired for jobs for reasons they didn't fully understand. There was an explanation for it, but not anymore. DSM-5 has reinstated the age of onset.
When did DSM-5 come out, or when did they?
Oh, 2013.
2013, okay.
The DSM-4 was from 1994, or the DSM-4R revised was 1994 to 2013, which kind of corresponds roughly, 2000, okay. I want to say this graph is off. I'm pretty sure it was 94. But anyway. And again, the role of environmental toxins is another very popular area to research. You've probably heard of, the effectiveness of gluten and casein-free diets for some kids with autism. There are some parents who, when they eliminated gluten and casein from their children's diets, like the turnaround in behavior was just astronomical.
Is that because of, I know there's
it like causes a buildup in like their intestines, and like it's like the leakage like causes the autism symptoms. That's a very oversimplification.
Have you heard of like the dyes, like especially the red dye?
Yes.
That's another big one.
Right. But here's the thing. Well, they do studies, and they find an association between some variant of gene X47 and autism, but often what's not done is replications, right? They don't do the exact same study or look for the exact same marker in other people with autism, right? And when they do, they often find that different samples of people with autism don't show the kind of the same markers as as kind of this original study suggested. But it's, when you think about the level of environmental toxins that we are exposed to every day, it doesn't seem like an avenue for research that is far off. I mean, chances are some people might be born with kind of genetic vulnerability that when they kind of experience or ingest a toxin kind of at the right point, that this kind of sets off a chain reaction. But we do know that it's not immunizations, right?
What's interesting too, I don't know if you're going to talk about it, is like if one sibling has it, it's more likely that the other one will have it too.
Right. So there is a hereditary component.
Yes.
And often what you will see is, maybe one family member will have a diagnosis. So I saw this a lot when I was doing my employment services work. Like there's one guy in particular, I went to his house, and this guy my client had autism, and I met his dad, who didn't have a diagnosis of autism, but he was showing characteristics of the broader autism phenotype, right? Like he definitely had just a little touch of it. You just kind of the same mannerisms. And so, right, so there is definitely a hereditary component. So again, this is just showing kind of the main areas of the brain that researchers have found kind of differences in with respect to the structure in people with autism versus people without autism. So we see altered neurons and connections, the oversized amygdala, a larger hippocampus. So again, people have put a lot of effort into trying to kind of isolate a smoking gun, as it were. This kind of one brain abnormality that's going to explain all of autism.
But it's never going to, because that's why it's on the spectrum. No one's going to be the same.
Right.
So
think about autism. Autism affects social behavior. It can affect sensory integration. It affects motor development. I mean, already those are three separate parts of the, well, maybe the sensory part and the motor development could be kind of related parts of the brain. But it's hard to believe that we're going to find kind of one common cause that's going to account for all of this stuff.
Even the social side of it, I mean, could be different. And
yeah, right. And there's not just one part of the brain that's fully devoted to social interaction. It's a network, the social brain network. There are many places in the brain. So, just a quick overview of autism. What do we think? We got a chance to read Haslam's piece. He talks about a number of different kind of kinds that we can use to classify disability. Would anyone like to make a guess? How might autism be categorized based on Haslam's scheme here? Would it be a natural kind? Who remembers what a natural kind was based on his taxonomy?
Natural accounts of mental disorders cannot always be confidently disallowed.
Right. Generally, a natural kind has a very specific biological marker. Who can think of one? Like a condition such that, you know, if there's an extra one of these chromosomes, and this person will 100% have this disability.
Down syndrome?
Down syndrome. That's an example of a natural kind. There's a direct relationship between that extra chromosome and Down syndrome.
Same with CP, spasticity of the muscles.
Right.
That'd be another one.
But as we saw in the previous slide, and then the one before that, well, there really is no kind of, biological marker that's going to convey a one-to-one chance of getting autism. So certainly not a natural kind.
It's either fuzzy or non-kinds, I'm thinking.
Right. So the discrete kind. The discrete kind is a category in which membership is dichotomous, the category boundary being objectively discoverable rather than conventional or pragmatic, but which is not grounded in a single defining or causally determining essential property. Why wouldn't autism fit here? Is membership in autism dichotomous? You either definitely have it or you definitely do not have it? Not necessarily. No. I mentioned this idea of the broader autism phenotype. Some people do show characteristics, autistic traits, but don't have a diagnosis. And the fuzzy kind was trichotis membership, right? Those that are unambiguous category members, those that are unambiguous non-category members, and then those who kind of aren't as easily classifiable, right? They're kind of in the middle. I definitely think that, this model, the fuzzy kinds model, could, be applied to autism. Because certainly there are people at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Yes, autism, no autism, we're 100% sure. But we do have kind of these borderline cases in the middle. And again, where we place the cutoff point here is arbitrary. But it should be, a cutoff point that is going to convey, good to the individual. Practical kind. What was a practical kind? What is the main component of a practical kind?
So many personality traits appear to be dimensions. Kind of the personality psychologists generally take them to be intrinsically continuous in nature and reject any crude attempt to reduce them to refined types. Right. So while there's no kind of underlying discontinuity when we're talking about a practical kind, like we don't see like an objective cutoff point, but where we do place that cutoff point makes practical sense, right? If we give a student, who's hyperactive, a diagnosis of ADHD, well, there's a good chance that, the medication that student might, be prescribed and the additional time on tests and instructional supports are going to serve a very practical function for that kid. They're going to help her or him be successful in school. So that it's not fully arbitrary. There's a reason for it, and that reason makes practical sense. And then lastly, the non-kind. Right, this is something, a cutoff that is completely arbitrary. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't confer any practical advantage to the individual. Which is a pretty kind of straightforward. Cool. Well, that's all I had for tonight. Were there any other questions or anything? Well, I think it was a nice discussion. Thank you for your contributions. And
I will send the email with the APA requirements and the Purdue OWL link. And if you have any questions about the paper or anything, feel free to reach out to me, okay?
All right. Thank you.
All right. I will see you all next week.
Right. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.